Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this episode in our webinar series with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley Ludke, and I will be your moderator for this episode titled Preparing for Museum Data Migration. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She's also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Great. Thank you so much, Bradley. Thanks to Lucidea for having us today, and thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Here's what we're going to cover. First, we're going to talk about the main data migration activities so that we're all working from the same reference point in terms of what does data migration entail. We'll then get into how to prepare for museum data migration, what those different steps look like. And then, of course, while we migrate things, and that is certainly the bulk of the work and activity that we do, there is going to be some post-migration data cleanup and refinement that is natural to almost every project. So we'll cover a bit of that as well, so that by the end of this webinar, you are familiar with the preparation going into migration, the actual act of getting through that migration, and then that post-migration workload, what does that look like? So the main data migration activities first is to ascertain how your data can be extracted from your current collections management system, or CMS. So if you're a museum that has your data, your records, object records already in a collections management system database, you will do some investigation on how that data can leave your current database and enter into a new CMS database. If you don't currently have a CMS database, then that's fine. You don't need to worry about this step. And I would just recommend, if there is some other alternative tracking method, perhaps a spreadsheet, for example, that you investigate where that data is and what it looks like. Whether you are looking at a database or a spreadsheet or what have you, while you are reviewing it, I would like you to assess the quality of your current data. So what does it look like? Is it complete? Does it follow standards? Things like that. And then, much as I asked you to learn how your data will leave your current CMS, you also need to be aware and learn how your data will then enter into your new CMS. And we'll talk about what that looks like. And then, how do you evaluate migrated data in a new CMS and refine the migration process as needed? So the how does your data leave part, depending on if you're in a collections management system, it will depend on if it is proprietary, open source, or homegrown. If you're working with a proprietary CMS, there's typically a vendor attached. And the good news is that means you have someone you can contact directly who will know how data can leave their system. If you're using an open source product, it will depend on how much information is available about that product in that open source community. Some open source CMS products are better than others, and some of those open source community forums are better than others as well. So if you're using an open source CMS that has a robust community, has great documentation, then you'll probably be able to find the answers that you need. However, if you're using an open source product where there's not as much documentation or the community is not as active, this may be more difficult, and it may be an opportunity or an opportunity to reach out to an expert or work with a consultant to figure out how you can get your data out. And then, of course, if you are using a homegrown system, that typically looks like using an Access database or FileMaker Pro. And it means that it is on usually your computer or your server, very hyper localized, and only the person who built that system will typically know how best it can be extracted. So, depending on who that is for you, whether it is yourself, an IT department, an outside consultant, working with that group to figure out how your data can leave and then be migrated into your new CMS. As you start thinking about how to take your data out, there needs to be a bit of an assessment on the quality of that data, because we can put data into our new CMS, but as we're doing so, if there's any sort of cleanup that needs to happen, it could impact the efficacy or success rate of your data, making it to the correct locations it needs to in the new CMS. This aspect can be quite complex depending on your data. So I do encourage you to check out a couple of our previous webinars so that you can get more of that step-by-step piece on what the data assessment looks like. Those two webinars are evaluating the shape of museum data and strategies for museum data remediation, or in other words, data cleanup. Now, to learn how data can enter the new CMS. And this is essentially when you extract your CMS data from the current database, it will typically extract as a file type. And when we're talking about putting it into a new database, we need to know what file types are accepted by that new database. So basically, is it a file type that can communicate successfully with your new CMS, so that the file type and the data within can tell the new CMS where that data is supposed to go. The most common types of file formats that your data can exist in when outside of a CMS is a comma separated value, or a .csv file format, a JavaScript object notation, or JSON, which is the .json file type, the extensible markup language, or XML file type, and then the application programming interface. And this is not necessarily a file type versus an actual, and you will likely hear of the word API, being extracted via API from the current database if it is available online to the new database, also if it is available online. Now to evaluate the migrated data and refine. So as you are taking a look at that data that's come out of your system, you'll want to make sure that it came out in a coherent form, because sometimes that is not always the case. So checking to make sure that the data within each of the fields is accurate, that's the field that they're supposed to be in. Checking to make sure that there wasn't data that was combined or perhaps separated out as it was extracted, and that it is essentially the way that you would assume it looks like as correct in the spreadsheet. If that's the case, and if your data is relatively straightforward, then typically you'll only need a very simple or like a one-time migration. However, the more complex your data is, or the more additional field types, or the amount of customized fields, whether customized fields from your old database and or into the new database, the more complex and more iterative it is going to be for your migration process. And so just know that as you enter that migration period, you'll need to plan for, most likely, more than one migration test to get your data successfully from one CMS to another. And depending on the database and how the data is getting extracted and then put in, there may be the necessity for test scripts in order to do that. For example, if you are migrating into an open source database that requires a command code line application of doing bulk upload, then it may be helpful for you to work with an expert or someone who knows how to create test scripts for helping to do that bulk work, versus you having to try and break it down and do it in batches, which would take much longer and be more frustrating for you. Now, how to prepare for museum data migration. The overall strategy that I encourage you to use is to review the current CMS data for each record area. What are the record types that you are using? What are the fields and the typical descriptive standards you're following in those fields? And have a really good sense of what your data looks like in this current system. Next, I want you to review the new CMS data structure for each of those areas. Is it an easy one-for-one? Sometimes it is that simple. Or if you're shifting the way you use a museum CMS, or if you're shifting your away into a more specialized subject matter specific CMS, there may be different areas and not quite as straightforward a one-for-one match in terms of where you want your data to go in the new system. And then evaluate how the current data fits in that new CMS. So especially if it is that more complex, that second option, you'll need to do some data mapping to document where your current data is and where that current data needs to go in the new system. Now, how to prepare for museum data migration. Think of some of these evaluation prompts as you think about your system, your data, and where you're hoping to go next. First, what are the required fields according to the CMS setup? What are the required fields in your current data, and what do those translate to in the new system? And then what are the fields the museum uses currently, and how do those map to the new CMS fields in the record template? And record template is the typical record and fields that you would use that are either required or recommended. Now, for that preparation of migration, continuing on these evaluation prompts, are there any discrepancies in how the data is entered into your current CMS field and field by field? And how has it been formatted in the new CMS field? So this is asking you to take a little bit of a deeper look from that record level to a field level of what does your data look like currently in that field and what is it going to look like in that new CMS. If those match, great. If they don't match, then that's going to add some complexity either to the migration itself or perhaps add to a post-migration cleanup. Then think about, according to this evaluation, which fields have data missing but will be required in the new system. So for example, perhaps past data entry practices in your current CMS, there was a field that wasn't used that is now considered best practice or is considered required. In the new CMS, you'll want to set up your template where that field is required, and so records can't save successfully without that field being filled in with data. If the data is missing in your current records, but that data needs to be present when it's migrated to the new system, you may need to retroactively enter that data in before migration or work with an expert, and if it's a vendor, to get that data added during that migration. And according to this evaluation, which fields have data that will need to be reformatted? So depending on the CMS that you're in and as your data practices have evolved, there are ways that we used to enter data that we have now changed. For example, depending on what CMS system you're in, the way you enter your date format could be very different. Perhaps it is the Americanized version, but you're now switching to a European-based CMS, and so date format is going to be different. So paying attention to where data formatting may have changed or will be changing as you move your data into a new system. All right, now in terms of items required for successful data migration, I want you to be aware of these things as you prepare for that. Required fields need to be completed with data. So again, thinking about in the new CMS, what's required, do you have data there? If not, you will need to create that data. Making sure that you have the fields mapped so that there's like for like, so that if you are mapping a title field from your current system, that it's going into the title field of the new system, and making sure that the fields you are assigning as you go along either accept just alphabet only or numeric only or alphanumeric. So paying attention to those as well. Also, in any sort of migration, you will need to have a unique record identification number for each and every one of your records. As you're migrating things over, the new system may assign a new record ID, which is fine. You'll need to have at least an existing unique record ID so that you can maintain the relationships that may have been built upon that ID from your current system. For example, if you have an object record and it has its own unique record ID tied to an exhibition loan record, that unique ID and that relationship to that loan record is tied by the unique ID record. So that's why it is so important to have those maintained as you're migrating over. Also, take a look at the image file names and that it is in the corresponding records. So if you've got images or digital assets attached to your records, hopefully your current system is also capturing the file name, and if there's a pathway to where they are accessing that file when that record gets pulled up. Those are all relationships, links, and file names that need to be tracked as you migrate those into the new system. It is fairly easy for digital assets to get abandoned or orphaned during this process. So I highly encourage you spending some time in testing how this migrates over and what data you may need to add to the migration process that's getting dropped by your current system. And finally, make sure you have consistent authority records. So authority meaning, are you using a specific vocabulary for like your object names? Those can be Getty Thesaurus, Art and Architecture Thesaurus, Library of Congress, any official authority on your vocabularies that you, one, know which authorities you're referencing and that you're using them consistently so that as you move into the new system, all of those vocabularies will be recognized and continue to be enforced in your data. And then thinking about that post-migration data cleanup and refinement, there are two primary approaches here. The first one is helping to address any gaps in your museum data. So any fields that are required or considered very highly recommended that may be empty of data currently, helping to address those once you have your data in the new system. And then second, the refinement of data to increase discoverability and use. So in this second approach, the data is in there in that required or highly recommended field, but it may not be optimal, fully complete, or following your style guide or best practices in terms of the descriptive content. So taking a look and taking time to further refine your data, improve the accuracy or improve the amount of detail or information that is being included, all will help to increase the discoverability of that particular record that you've done that additional work on. And of course, if it is increasingly easier to discover that information, it will increase the ability to use that information. So it's a nice knock-on benefit. For approach number one, for a little bit more detail, so this is taking a look at the gaps in your data. So think about some of these scenarios and how that it may fit for you. First, the museum receives a grant to support research and fuller description creation for a set of 100 items. So you've done that assessment, you've identified, okay, the current location field is missing from our data, and we're gonna identify like these top 100 records of like the most important objects currently. And so writing a grant to bring in a assistant registrar or project cataloger to help fill in those missing gaps, in this example, like a location field, and having that additional capacity, albeit temporary, to help address the gap in your data. As the descriptive work takes place, this would be an opportune time for you to also improve keywords. So as you are in your data and helping to address gaps, if you're not already using the concept of keywords, subjects, or search terms, I highly recommend you spend some additional few minutes utilizing that feature in your new CMS, because this will also increase your ability to find what you need for your job, as well as for your community of users to find what it is that they're looking for in your collection and engage with it more easily. Approach number two. So here's a scenario that may be applicable for that strategy. So the museum receives a graduate student intern for the summer. So interns are wonderful. They are how we were able to get a good chunk of our work done in the year, and it's a great way to introduce hands-on experience for a graduate student and soon to be new professional. So with that premise in mind, the student in that case is familiar already with museum best practices and may already have exposure to collections management system and cataloging. With that in mind, do a similar carve out, 100 or so, or however many quantity wise is feasible for the duration, and have the graduate student focus on that set of records, with focusing first on like 1 to 2 fields for cleanup. So In this case, the data is present, but it could be further refined, whether that is helping to fill out the more completeness of the record, helping to add additional detail, or helping to make sure that the record is correct and the fields are being used correctly and clarified. So in this case, we're helping to address data that exists currently, but improving it so that it would improve its discoverability and therefore usability. All right, post-migration data cleanup and refinement. So this means that we've got the data out of your current system. We've even put the data into your new system, but there are inevitably going to be a few hangers-on of things where it couldn't get fixed either before migration or during migration, but it still is important to address once you've gotten it into your system in order for everything to work correctly and as accurately as you need for your job. So knowing that is important, we also acknowledge that the capacity for many of us is that you're doing 3 jobs at once in the time of 1 job. So that discussion of when do we fit this in, where does it fit in priorities, and how can we scale this so that we can achieve very discrete chunks at very specific times versus it being never done at all or so overwhelming it's hard to fit in. So here's an option. As a part of a larger project, you can do some data refinement or data cleanup as you are already touching the records. So if you're working on a particular exhibit that is coming up, and so a selection of 100 objects are going to be used and help inform the exhibition catalog, you are already in those records and doing some of the work while you are in there in anticipation for and creation of this exhibition catalog. In which case, while you are already in that record, is there anything else that could be done to help improve either data missing or data that could be more fully complete or refined? Another option is putting in a dedicated time period and a dedicated person to help focus on and execute the data refinement over a very discrete set of data. So sometimes for us, it is easier to schedule in 2 hours every other Friday to do a data cleanup on maybe just a dozen or so records each time. Or maybe there's one person in our department where they get to select one day and that day is designated as data cleanup day. You can get very creative with this, and ultimately it will be whatever works best for your brain and what works best for your calendar and other responsibilities. The key here is to get creative with how you schedule that in and making sure that you're carving out achievable chunks of this data cleanup so that you can actually fit it in and be successful at it. So some additional reading, because as much as we covered today, it was really a broader level process of what we do in preparation for migration through to post-migration cleanup. So if you would like to read more, we have a few more blog posts that have to do with the quality and format of your museum data, where you can find it, and what are some of the strategies for data cleanup. So going into some more specifics in terms of what data cleanup can look like and creating a plan for it. So we recommend you check those out. And in conclusion, we covered the main data migration activities. So you've got an overall picture of what you can anticipate when you enter in this particular type of project. We talked about how to prepare for that museum data migration. What are some of the higher level things to look for? And then we also covered what that post-migration data cleanup and refinement can look like with some specific examples of how you can achieve it. And of course, we left you with some additional reading. And before I let you go, we do have a new book out, Prepared for Takeoff, Get Your Museum Digital Project Off the Ground. And this book is all about museums and digital projects. It doesn't matter what type of digital project. All of the content in this book can be applied, workflows, best practices, suggested strategies in terms of how to digitize and create metadata, enhance metadata for your projects. So hopefully you'll find some great strategies and workflows to apply to your current workplace and help you be more efficient and also feel better supported. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you. If you have any more questions on any of our software or our company in general, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today. And until next time, thanks.